My name is Dana, and I was 31 years old the day my sister laughed at me for asking for my own money back. Not a little laugh. Not an uncomfortable, nervous laugh. A full, dismissive sound, the kind that tells you the person making it has never once considered that you might be serious. She said, "Mom told me you were fine. You don't actually need it." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list the years. I just said, "Okay," and I walked back to my car, and I sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, and something in my chest went very, very still. Because I knew something she didn't. I had been sending her $1,800 a month for 6 years. Every transfer had a label. Every label was the same word: loan. And for 6 years, I had a spreadsheet, dated, itemized, signed by both of us the first year when we'd drawn up the terms together at our mother's kitchen table. $129,600. I knew exactly where that document was. What happened next, in a room full of people who all thought they knew our family story, is why I'm sitting here telling you this today. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If you're new here, hit subscribe, and if you've ever been told your memory of events is just your interpretation, drop a comment below, because this one is for you. I want to start at the beginning because the ending only means something if you understand where I came from. I grew up in Clarksburg, West Virginia, a town that smells like wood smoke in October and like rust the rest of the year. My father worked for a regional freight company for 22 years, and my mother managed the books for 3 different small businesses out of our dining room for most of my childhood. We were not poor. We were not comfortable. We were the kind of family that replaced the washing machine when the second repair estimate came back higher than a used unit from the appliance place on Route 50, and we were proud of the math that produced that decision. My sister Renee is 4 years older than me. When we were growing up, she was the one people noticed: bright laugh, easy with strangers, the kind of person who makes a room feel like a party just by walking in. I was the one who showed up early to help set up and stayed late to put the chairs back. That was the dynamic, and for a long time I didn't question it, because I genuinely loved her. She was my sister. Of course I loved her. I left Clarksburg at 18 on a partial scholarship to a state school in Morgantown, majored in accounting, and graduated into a job at a mid-sized firm that did tax work for regional medical practices. I was good at it. I liked the precision of it, the way a balance sheet either reconciled or it didn't. There was no gray area. Either the numbers told the truth or someone had been careless, and usually you could find out which by looking at the right column. Renee didn't finish her associate's degree. That's not a criticism. I'm stating it because it's relevant to what came later. She moved to Charleston when she was 24, started doing front desk work at a salon, met a man named Marcus who managed a warehouse, and for a few years things seemed fine. They had a decent apartment. They took a trip to Myrtle Beach. They seemed like 2 people building something. Then Marcus left. Not dramatically, there was no scene, no confrontation I was ever told about. He just gradually became less present, and then one day Renee called me and said he was gone, and the lease was only in her name, and she didn't know how she was going to cover it. That was a Thursday in early March, 7 years ago. I was 25. I had been at my firm for 2.5 years. I had paid off my car. I had a small savings account that I was quietly proud of, and I had a habit of tracking every dollar that came in and went out of my life in a spreadsheet I kept updated every Sunday night. I want you to hold that detail. The spreadsheet. It matters. I told Renee I would help. Of course I would. She was my sister, she was in a real bind, and I had more cushion than she did. We talked about the amount. Her rent was $1,400, plus utilities she estimated around $400, and I said I could do $1,800 a month. Not forever, but while she got on her feet. And then, and this is the part one need you to understand, was not something I did out of distrust. It was something I did because I am a person who works in numbers and I believe in writing things down. I said, "Can we write it down? Just so we both have the same understanding." Renee hesitated. I heard it on the phone. A half-second pause. Then she said, "Yeah. Okay. Sure." We drew up something simple. Not a formal legal document. Just a written agreement that said I would provide $1,800 a month as a loan, that she would begin repaying once she was back on her feet, and that the total outstanding balance would accrue interest-free until she was in a position to start We wrote it at our mother's kitchen table over the following weekend. Both of us signed it. Mom witnessed it. I kept the original. I photographed it and saved the photo to a cloud folder labeled, with the professionalism of a person who has worked in tax accounting for 2.5 years, Renee Loan Documentation. I set up an automatic transfer on the 3rd of every month.
$100.
Memo line, loan R. And then I updated my spreadsheet. The person I want to tell you about before I go any further is my great-aunt Cecile. Aunt Cecile was my grandmother's younger sister, and at the time this story begins, she was 73 years old and lived alone in a house in Parkersburg that she had owned outright since 1987. She was a retired paralegal, 31 years with the same estate law firm, retiring only when the senior partner died and the practice closed. She had, in her own words, seen every variety of human foolishness that can be committed with a signature or the absence of one, and she had opinions about documentation that aligned perfectly with my own. Cecile was not close with my mother's side of the family. There was an old disagreement, the kind that calcifies over decades into a wall nobody remembers building, and so she and I had our own separate relationship, built mostly through phone calls I started making in college when I was looking for someone who understood numbers and also understood family. She had both. She also had a filing cabinet with color-coded tabs that she referred to as her evidence of a life well administered, and every time I visited, she would show me a new section, as though presenting a small triumph. I called Cecile every few weeks. I told her about the loan to Renee. She asked me twice whether I had it in writing. I said yes both times. She said, "Good girl," and I could hear her nodding through the phone. She became, over the course of the following years, the only person outside my own apartment who knew the full picture of what I was carrying. For the first year and a half, things were quiet. Renee found a better job, not a great one, but steadier. She moved to a slightly smaller apartment. She called me on birthdays and holidays. She never mentioned the loan, and I never pressed it because she was still getting stable and I was still financially comfortable enough that the monthly transfer didn't hurt me. I want to be precise about something. It did not go unnoticed in our family that I was helping Renee. My mother knew. My two aunts on that side, Renee's aunts, both of them, knew in the general way that families know things, which is to say they knew Dana's been helping Renee out, without knowing the specific figure or the written terms. And for a while, that was fine. Helping family is not something I was embarrassed about. What changed, gradually, was the way it was talked about. The first time I noticed it, Renee had been in Charleston for about 2 years. There was a family barbecue at my mother's house in the summer, and my Aunt Patricia, my mother's older sister, who had strong opinions about everything and the volume to match, was talking about Renee's apartment, how nice it was, how Renee had it so well organized. And someone said, "Dana's been helping with the rent," and Patricia said, "Oh, it's so sweet that Dana does that for her. So generous. Not pays the loan. Not contributes. Generous." I didn't correct it. I told myself it didn't matter. Patricia wasn't someone I was going to re-educate about financial terminology in the middle of a backyard with a paper plate in my hand. But I noticed. The second time I noticed it, Renee and I were on the phone. This was closer to year 3, and she mentioned in passing that she told her friend Gina that her sister helps cover her rent. I said carefully, "You know it's still a loan, right? We're still keeping track." And Renee said, "Oh, obviously, yeah. I know. Breezy. Unbothered. The way you say something to end a conversation." I updated my spreadsheet that Sunday. Year 3, $64,800 outstanding. Year 4 came, and with it a shift I didn't fully register at the time. My mother started referring to the transfers as what Dana does for Renee. My Aunt Patricia called it Dana's contribution to keeping the family steady. There was a dinner, Thanksgiving, year 4, where someone made a toast that included a line about the ways we take care of each other, and my mother looked at me with a specific kind of meaningful warmth that I realized, with a slow settling in my stomach, was the look of someone who believes a thing has been given rather than lent. I said nothing at Thanksgiving. I had the spreadsheet. I had the signed agreement. I was not worried. What I was, without fully naming it to myself, was tired. The transfers had not hurt me for the first 3 years. In year 4 they started to. Not devastatingly. I was still employed, I was still managing, but I had gotten a performance review that didn't come with the raise I'd expected, and I had a car repair that cost me $1,900, and for the first time since setting up the automatic transfer, I felt it leave my account at the beginning of the month. I thought about calling Renee and having the conversation. I thought about it for about 3 weeks, actually every Sunday when I updated the spreadsheet and saw the number tick upward. Year 4 total, $86,400. I thought, she knows. We agreed. When she's ready, she'll bring it up. She didn't bring it up. Year 5 arrived. Something else happened in year 5, which is that Renee started doing better. She got promoted to salon manager at a new place in Charleston, and from what she told me and what I saw on her social media, a thing I monitored with the detached attention of someone keeping records, she was taking weekend trips. New furniture appeared in photos. There was a weekend in Savannah with friends. She bought a car. None of these things were crimes. She was allowed to improve her life. But she had not called me to say, I'm doing better. Let's talk about the loan. And I had not pushed because I kept telling myself, she knows. The paper exists. When she's ready. In year 5, at Christmas, Renee pulled me aside at my mother's house and said she was really grateful for everything I'd done. You've been so good to me, she said. I don't know what I would have done without you. I said, that's what family's for. Because it seemed like the right thing to say, and because I was watching her face for any sign that she was about to pivot to the actual topic. She didn't pivot. She hugged me and went back to the living room. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my back against the wall, and something in my jaw went tight. I lost my job in February of year 6. The firm restructured. My entire department was reduced from 7 accountants to 4, and I was the most recently promoted, and therefore the most expensive of the 3 who were let go. It was not personal. My manager shook my hand and told me I was excellent at my work and that the severance package was fair, and I cleaned out my desk on a Friday afternoon and drove home and sat at my kitchen table and did the math. I had 5 months of expenses covered in savings. I had the severance. I had a strong resume and a specialty that was in demand, and I knew I would find something, but the window of financial comfort that had made the monthly transfers painless had just closed. I waited 2 weeks. I had a lead on a new position, and I wanted to see if it materialized before I called Renee. It didn't materialize in time. I called her on a Sunday. I'd updated the spreadsheet the night before. 6 years. $129,600. I told her I'd lost my job. She said she was sorry. That was awful. I said I was going to be fine, but I wanted to talk about the loan, specifically about whether she could begin some kind of repayment, even partial, while I was in this gap period. I wasn't asking for everything. I said even half over time would help. There was a pause. Then Renee said, Dana, I didn't realize you were still thinking of it that way. I kept my voice level. I said, we signed an agreement. It was always a loan. She said, I know we called it that, but for 6 years you just sent it. No one ever talked about repaying it. I kind of thought. She trailed off. I said, you kind of thought what? She said, I talked to Mom about it. Mom said you were doing well, and that you were fine with it. She said you never complained. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, so because I didn't complain, it became a gift? Renee's voice shifted, not cold, but firmed up. She said, I'm not trying to fight with you. I'm just saying I'm not in a position right now to start repaying a debt that I genuinely didn't know you considered active. That's not fair to drop on me. I said, I have the paperwork, Renee. She said, then do what you need to do with it. And her voice had the quality of someone ending a conversation rather than continuing one. I said, okay. And I hung up, and I sat very still for a moment. Then I called Cecile. Cecile listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, you have the original document? I said yes. She said, and 6 years of transfer records from the bank? I said yes. She said, and the spreadsheet is complete? I said yes, dated, monthly, running total, memo lines matching the transfers. She said, all right. Just that. The way she said it told me she already knew what I was going to do next, and she approved. I didn't do anything that week. I updated my spreadsheet, $129,600 outstanding, and I applied for 3 jobs, and I started being very quiet at family events. Not cold, just quiet. I watched. My cousin Brooke, my mother's brother's daughter, got engaged in April. She was 29. She was marrying a man named Carter who worked in commercial real estate, and the engagement dinner was held at a private room in an Italian restaurant in Morgantown that Carter's parents had reserved. 41 people. Round tables. Good lighting. The kind of event where everyone is dressed up and slightly on their best behavior because it is, technically, a celebration. Cecile was invited. She had known Brooke's father, my Uncle Gerald, since Gerald was small, and he had a long-standing fondness for her that had survived the old family wall. She drove up from Parkersburg the morning of. We had lunch together before the dinner. She had a leather portfolio with her, the kind with a zipper, the kind a paralegal carries. I noticed it, but didn't ask. She ordered the soup and told me about her drive and asked how the job search was going. I told her I had a second interview on Thursday. She said, "Good. You'll get it." She also said quietly over coffee, "Gerald asked me to bring some paperwork for him tonight. Estate planning. Nothing dramatic." I nodded. I didn't ask further because Cecile's expression told me the topic was closed for now. The dinner was the kind of event that starts with everyone performing joy and then gradually relaxes into something more natural as the wine comes out. Brooke and Carter were lovely. The toasts were sincere. I sat at a table with my Aunt Patricia, 2 of Brooke's friends I didn't know, and my mother. Renee was there. We had not spoken since the phone call. She was seated at the next table over, and when our eyes met briefly across the room, she gave me the particular flat, forward-facing look of someone who has decided a thing is resolved in her favor and is slightly bored by the continued existence of the issue. My mother had called me twice since the phone call with Renee. Once to say she hoped we could keep this between ourselves. Once to say she thought I was being a little rigid about the whole thing. I had been polite both times. I had not agreed with her characterization, and I had not argued with it. I had said, each time, "I hear you," and then said goodbye. Midway through the main course, my Aunt Patricia, who had had 2 glasses of wine and was feeling conversational, said something that landed differently than she intended. She was talking to one of Brooke's friends, explaining the family, and she gestured toward me and said, "And Dana's always been so generous with Renee. She's been paying her rent for years." She said it warmly, the way you say something that reflects well on the family. An asset. An anecdote. I set my fork down. Not loudly. Not dramatically. I set it down on the edge of my plate, and I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip, and I did not look at my mother, who I could feel, in my peripheral vision, watching me. Brooke's friend smiled politely and said something like, "Oh, that's so sweet." Patricia said, "That's just how this family is. We take care of each other." I looked up. I looked at Patricia with a very calm, very level expression, and I said, "It was a loan." Patricia laughed, the kind of social laugh that means let's not make this a thing, and said, "Oh, you know what I mean." I said, "I do. I just want to be clear about what it was." The table went slightly still. My mother said my name, one word, quiet, a request. And then Cecile, from the next table, turned around in her chair. She had been following the conversation, I realized. She turned in her chair with the leather portfolio on her lap, and she looked at me, not at the table, not at Patricia, at me, and she said, very calmly, "Dana, why don't we explain this properly?" And the room, in that particular way that rooms do when something shifts, went quiet enough that the tables nearest to us could hear. Cecile unzipped the portfolio. She didn't rush. She was a woman who had spent 31 years in estate law, and she knew exactly what the pace of a document review was supposed to feel like. She drew out a small stack of papers, 3 or 4 pages, I could see from where I was sitting, and she set them on the table in front of her as though she were preparing a client meeting. She said, "I want to read something. I want to be clear that this is a private family matter, but since it's been described publicly as something it isn't, I think the accurate version deserves to be in the room." Renee had turned around in her chair. I could see her, and I saw the moment her expression shifted from confused to alert. My mother said, very quietly, Cecile. Cecile said pleasantly, Carol. I'm not going to embarrass anyone. I'm just going to be accurate. She looked at the papers for a moment, then looked up at the room. Not performing, just making sure people were present. Dana has been transferring $1,800 a month to her sister since March of, she named the year, under a written loan agreement signed by both parties and witnessed by Carol.
She paused.
The total transfer to date is $129,600. The number landed in the room like a stone into still water. I watched it happen. I watched Patricia's smile go uncertain. I watched Brooke's friend look down at her plate. I watched my mother's posture change, a small collapse, like air going out of something. I watched Renee go pale, a sharp drain of color from her face that started at her forehead and moved downward. Carter's father, who was seated 2 tables away and had no context for any of this, leaned over to his wife and said something quietly. His wife shook her head fractionally. Cecile set the top page down. I could see it from my seat. It was a printed copy of the original agreement, the signatures visible at the bottom, and she picked up the second page. This is the bank transfer history, she said. 72 entries. All marked loan are. Every third of the month, without interruption, for 6 years. She set it down. The third document is the spreadsheet Dana maintained, showing the cumulative balance. Dated entries, matching the transfer records exactly. She set the stack of papers down neatly and zipped the portfolio closed. Then she looked at Renee. She said, I want to be fair to you, Renee. I know you may have understood this differently over time, but the documentation is what it is. Renee's mouth opened. Nothing came out. My mother said very quietly, I didn't think she'd. I told Renee that Dana wasn't. She stopped. I looked at my mother. She looked at me. Her hands were flat on the table. I said, quietly enough that only our immediate tables heard, I know what you told her, Mom. My mother's chin moved. One small motion downward. Not a nod exactly. More like a settling. Patricia said nothing. She was looking at the centerpiece. Cecile said, to the table at large, I think the rest of the evening belongs to Brooke and Carter. She smiled at Brooke, a genuine, warm smile. Congratulations, sweetheart. The dinner is beautiful. Brooke said, Thank you, Aunt Cecile. Her voice was careful. She was watching me. I picked up my fork. Uncle Gerald, who had been present for the whole thing and had the quality of a man who processes information carefully before responding, caught me by the arm as I was walking to the restroom about 20 minutes later. He said, I had no idea about any of this. His voice was low and direct. None of it. I said, I know. He said, Is that everything? Or is there more? I said, That's everything. He nodded. He looked like he was doing math in his head. He said, What do you need? I said, Nothing right now. I have a second interview on Thursday. He almost smiled. Good, he said. You'll get it. The drive home that night took 40 minutes. I spent the first 10 of them in silence, just driving with the window cracked and the spring air coming in cold, and somewhere in the second 10 minutes I became aware that my shoulders had dropped, not from tension but from the release of it, and I had been carrying something for so long I had stopped noticing the weight of it until it was gone. I called Cecile from the highway. She picked up on the second ring. I said, Thank you. She said, You did the work. I just read the documents. I said, Where did you get the transfer history? She said, You emailed it to me 3 weeks ago. You asked me to hold a copy. I had, in fact, done exactly that in a Sunday evening email I had not thought much about at the time. I said, You were prepared. She said, I'm always prepared.
Go home and get some sleep.
Thursday's important. Renee called the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 8 minutes long, and I listened to all of it.
She said she was sorry.
She said she'd told herself a story about what the money was for so long that she'd started to believe it. She said Mom had kept reinforcing that story, not out of malice, she said. She thought Mom just didn't want there to be a conflict, and she'd let it happen. She said she wasn't trying to make excuses. Then she said she wanted to figure out a repayment plan. I listened to the whole message. I sat with it for a day. Then I called her back. I told her I appreciated the honesty. I told her I wasn't looking for a dramatic reckoning. I just needed what we'd agreed to. I told her I'd send her a proposed repayment schedule, monthly installments, no interest, a 5-year window, and that if she needed to adjust the amounts based on what she could actually manage, we could talk about it. She said okay. She sounded smaller than she had in years. Not crushed, just accurate. Like someone who had finally put down something heavy. My mother called the day after Renee did. The call was harder. She said she'd been trying to help both of us, that she'd seen me doing well and seen Renee struggling, and she hadn't wanted the loan hanging over their relationship. I let her talk. She said she should have been more careful about how she characterized it to Renee. She said she didn't realize the number had gotten so large. I said, $129,600, Mom. In 6 years. She was quiet. I said, I'm not angry with you, but I need you to understand what happened. You told Renee I was fine with something I wasn't fine with. And because you said it, she believed it and it cost me. My mother said, I know. 2 words.
Just that.
And I believed her. We talked for another 20 minutes about other things, about Brooke's dinner, about how lovely the restaurant had been, about Thursday's interview. Before we hung up, she said, I'm proud of how you handled it. I didn't tell her that Cecile had done most of the handling. I just said, thanks, Mom. Patricia called Cecile, apparently, the following week. I heard this from Cecile, who told me with the particular dry amusement of someone who has seen every variety of human response to accountability. Patricia wanted to know where Cecile had gotten the documents. Cecile told her. Patricia wanted to know why Cecile had chosen that moment. Cecile told her that also. Patricia said she thought it could have been handled more privately. Cecile said it was handled privately for 6 years. Patricia didn't have a response to that. I got the job Thursday. Senior accountant, regional healthcare group, salary 15% higher than my previous position. I accepted on the phone in the parking lot of a coffee shop, and then I went inside and ordered a large coffee and sat by the window for a while, watching the street. The repayment agreement with Renee was finalized the following month. Monthly installments. 5-year window. She made the first payment on the 3rd of the month, just as I had once made mine. I received the notification on my phone, updated the spreadsheet, debit column now, for the first time, and set my phone face down on my desk. Something in my chest loosened. Cecile and I had dinner the following month in Parkersburg. She made pot roast and showed me a new section of the filing cabinet, something related to a property boundary dispute she'd helped a neighbor resolve, all filed under evidence of satisfactory resolution. I ate 2 servings. She poured herself a small glass of wine and said, You know what the lesson is, don't you? I said, Write it down. She said, Write it down. And make sure the right person is holding a copy. I said, I sent you the email 3 weeks before the dinner. She smiled.
You did.
You are your grandmother's granddaughter. I'd never heard her say that to me before. I felt something warm move through my collarbone and settle in my sternum, quiet and solid. We did the dishes together, and she told me about the property boundary dispute in full, and it was one of the better evenings I'd had in a long time. There's something I've thought about a lot in the months since. The difference between a document and a story. Stories drift. They get softened, editorialized, pass through the filter of whoever needs them to be a particular shape. My mother needed the loan to be a gift because gifts don't create conflict. Renee needed it to be a gift because gifts don't require anything of the recipient. Over time, the story of the thing had drifted so far from the thing itself that an entire room full of people who loved me had accepted a version of events that cost me $129,000. Documents don't drift. Dates don't negotiate. Transfer records don't adjust themselves to match what people wished had happened. I am not, by nature, a confrontational person. I don't enjoy drama. I prefer the Sunday evening spreadsheet to the Saturday night scene. But I learned something in that Italian restaurant, watching the color leave my sister's face as Cecile read from a stack of paper. Patience is only a virtue if someone is keeping records. Block 7. Rule of 3 recap. That's my story. A signed agreement, a Sunday night spreadsheet, and a great aunt who drove from Parkersburg with a leather portfolio. I want to ask you something before I go because I genuinely want to know. Have you ever had a clear agreement with a family member, something written down, something you both understood, that got slowly rewritten by the story everyone else decided to tell about it? Not through one big lie, but through 100 small ones, told by people who maybe weren't even trying to deceive, just trying to smooth things over? If that's ever happened to you, tell me how it resolved in the comments below. Or tell me it hasn't resolved yet. Those comments I read most carefully because I understand the waiting better than I'd like to. Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.